Hello, everybody. I'm Petey the Power Dragon here, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different from my normal content. Today we're going to do a tier list. I know, glorious. But we're just going to go through faction by faction and rank them on a tier list. Please note, this is pretty much as subjective as they come. And please do not be offended if you think that one faction should be put in a different spot than another faction. I guarantee you Duke has already typed in my comment section that I've done something wrong. Which, you know, fair enough. I mean, he is the maker of the mod. He can do what he wants. Of course, in making this tier list, I have to do a few compromises with the flags. So, specifically, Thalia here is going to represent Skeggy, and Kislev here is going to represent the Decadent Host. Purely because I cannot really find the extensive flag models that Duke made for them in a way that allows me to import them into this website. So honestly, my apologies to Duke, because and I do plan to make a Skeggy overview video just like I did with the Decadent Host. But we're gonna go into some factions now. First off, Beastmen. Oh man, these guys are gonna be contentious. So Beastmen have recently gotten a bit of a rework. Specifically because Beastmen, they've always been a very strong faction. Always relied on that kind of fear striking into your lines. And they are proper noob stompers. They're incredibly quick, and they're incredibly powerful. And there's a bit of just stuff they do. As you can see, I've ranked this tier list in terms of Realm of the Gods, great, good, average, may need a rework, and requires extensive skill. Because I think that the basic S to D tier kind of method is a bit unproductive. Now for the Beastmen, I'm going to put them in great. And there are a few reasons for this. One, Minotaurs now have marks with the most recent patch, which means like Tzeentchian Minotaurs are really scary. And you can do everything from make a Cornate Minotaur Butcher, and basically just have the penultimate Shaft Chomper, to Minotaurs with shields and Tzeentchian, and you can make them incredibly tanky and resilient. But it's not that versatility of Minotaurs. They just, in general, have always been a fairly strong pick, with a mixture of Chaos Marks and Bestigors. Ungor Raiders are not to be underestimated. Neither is their potential cavalry force or Razor Gore chariots. And they do honestly, in my opinion, have some very good lord options. Malagor is and likely always will be great. Same thing with Morgur. No matter how many times Duke nerfs him, he will always be a very valid pick for Chaos Spawn, and just making sure that you can really buff up those lines. So I'm going to put Beastmen in great. The only reason they don't get into Realm of the Gods is because they are kind of stuck in a very specific playstyle, and a lot of opponents can recognize that, and there are a few factions that they will undoubtedly have hard times against. Like, Beastmen can have difficulty against, they could have some difficulty against vampire counts, for instance, and like, factions that can kind of stand and then punch back, even Greenskins here. Their hated rivals, the Wood Elves. Now, the thing about the Wood Elves is that Wood Elves are one of those really high skill cap factions. They're incredibly powerful, but also incredibly lightweight. They have very good cav, and Orion's Horn of the Wild Hunt rework, where it's now a summon, makes him an incredibly good pick, especially when running alongside cavalry. These two, actually, Beastmen and Wood Elves, used to be quite the 2v2 combo, because of the Wood Elves bringing a lot of the shock cavalry and the skirmish power, and the Beastmen would bring a lot of the heavier stuff. I'm going to put Wood Elves in good, and the reason for this is twofold. One, Wood Elves, just like Beastmen, are squishy, but Wood Elves have a lot more squishiness in general. They don't have as much cost-effective stuff as the Beastmen do, in terms of like chaff or frontline infantry. And they don't have as much like effective harassers like dogs that the Beastmen do. Their skirmish play is definitely very, very strong, but can also be caught out. Like, nothing annoys a Wood Elf player more than like a line of Quarrelers or Jezzails, because it just kind of invalidates their skirmish play. But because they're just like such a high skill cap faction, I'm gonna keep them in good. Bretonnia. Oh boy. These guys are fairly interesting. So, Bretonnia is interesting. The first thing to note is, like, with all the blessing reworks, Bretonnia has definitely got a lot more punching power, just direct punching power. It's also worth note that I am including sub-factions in this. So, the fact that Bretonnia has so many versatile sub-factions, like Bordello, like Chevaliers de Lyonnaise, it's definitely like a worthy mention, because Bretonnia borders give them a real good leg up against like the undead. And Bretonnian, what's the word? Chevaliers, too, with Unbreakable. So, as well as Arbalists, too. Arbalists being AP, and a whole lot of their cav being very cost effective. With Knights of the Realm, they have very good lord options. In terms of direct weaknesses, they can definitely suffer from straight up infantry fights, as well as have issues competing with factions with just a lot of terror, as well as, while you're not limited purely to the cav game, the cav game is like your main killer. So it can be, while a very experienced Bretonnia player can definitely catch opponents off guard. Example of these would actually be the Duke himself. If you guys ever swing by his channel, he really likes some strong infantry and arbalists with his Bretonnia, and that can be very useful against a faction like Tomb Kings. So I'm gonna put them in good, just ahead of the Wood Elves. Dwarves. I'm gonna be putting the Great Book of Grudges for wherever I put these guys, honestly. Here's the thing. Dwarves are deceptively easy. People tend to look at dwarves and they say, alright, wow, I mean, like, how hard can it really be? You'd be surprised how good the dwarves are. And how micro-intensive the dwarves are. Because dwarves are so slow, you have to be very constantly changing between units. There are, starting out with their pros. So pros, they have very strong artillery and very reliable infantry, as well as very good leadership and good lords. Their rune magic has been changed significantly, where it's a far more versatile tool and a very helpful one. And they do have some great unique sub-faction units. They no longer have lacking magic attacks. They're very good at dealing with hordes thanks to the Gromrail picks, and they have a lot of surprisingly good flanking power, with Rangers and Storm Wardens and Gilded, as well as Proven. As for the cons, they have a general lack of things like Fear and Terror, as well as a fairly not mobile core. While dwarves can play aggressively, it's far more of a consistent pressure buildup that dwarves have, as opposed to the immediate hammer and anvil that people might get used to if they're playing a faction like Bretonnia or the Wood Elves. Dwarves are far more different. Dwarves keep up a consistent amount of pressure. Dwarves grind you down on the offense, in my opinion, better than the defense. So, With Dwarves, I do think that they are about on par with Bretonnia right now, but they are better than the Wood Elves, so I'm going to put them right there in good. Greenskins, I don't think anyone is going to disagree with me, and I'm not even going to beat around the bush. They are Realm of the Gods. Everything from gigantic spiders to powerful goblin armies, heavy pratas to give you a nice bit of goblin punching power. Greenskin missile play in Daka is, it's nasty. From poison and rusty airs, engaging in a melee fight with greenskins can be just complete suicide. Thanks to Biggins carving through chaff and Black Orcs supporting. They have some of the best lore choices in the game. I don't think anyone will try and make the claim that like Grimgor or Wurzag or Azag is bad. Skarsnik is an amazing utility lord. They're just so all around crazy that it is just insane. And I feel I'd be remiss here if I didn't mention, on top of their cavalry, their great monsters and chariots. Because obviously everybody knows about the cost-effective greenskin cavalry forces. Harassers like spiders, and gigantic spiders, and boar boys even, and boar chariots, and styling pump wagons. But stone trolls and river trolls are very good. I personally prefer river trolls for the cost effectiveness, but stone trolls as a nice tanky option are always very welcome. Giants with their speed, Arachnaroks with their monster killing. There are no real... the biggest weakness to the greenskins immediately is occasionally being subject to routing through terror. And that's an issue that a whole lot of factions suffer from, so I'm not going to fault them too heavily for it. So, that is why I think that Greenskins are an S tier faction. Lizardmen. Alright. These guys have gone under a lot of change as of late, and I do not think that anyone will try and dispute that. I mean, their lords have undergone a lot of changes. Nakai has gone from a force to be reckoned to a bit less so of a force to be reckoned. With the Golden Tributes rework and the General Lizardmen rework, Lizardmen have gotten some unique units finally with Nakai, not Nakai, Tenowin and his Red Host, which has been fairly helpful for them, but it does have its general downsides, which is like Lizardmen can be a bit of a plotting army. They can be very vulnerable to like AoE damages because a lot of their units are very tightly packed together. They can occasionally suffer issues from large, like, AP Cav, I honestly think is a great counter to Lizardmen. Because they don't have a lot of Cav that can ride out and take it head on. And with the Temple Guard rework, with them no longer being a very good answer to Cav, and now far more of like an almost hybrid Crocscore unit, Lizardmen have to put a lot of faith in like their hunting packs, like their salamanders, or their feral dinosaurs, like their carnosaurs. So I think I'm going to put them at the very back of good, because they do still have primal instincts. They are still a very strong faction, especially in the right hands, but they don't have a lot of that like clear, wow, something that really says this is incredibly strong, that some other factions that we will talk about later also have. Alright, Tomb Kings. Alrighty, Tomb Kings are... I'm going to change this because I think just average is a good term right here. Now, Tomb Kings are pretty darn good. I don't think a lot of people will try and dispute that. Tomb Kings have a lot of very strong, just versatility, honestly. Like, they have great range play. If you watched the most recent David and Goliath tournament, over with the Duke, I can leave a link down in the description below if you haven't already. The Tomb Kings really stood out and shined with their ranged builds. Tomb Scorpions are just as much of a threat as ever, and they are just incredibly good. They're versatile. They have fantastic lords from Katep to Setra to Archon to Khalida. They have very good constructs in Cav. They have a lot of healing play. They have a lot of good magic play. Nakaran horsemen and just their basic cavalry is very, very good. Same thing with their chariots. They can play defensively. They can play aggressively. They can play hybrid style. They can play Cav force. They do have weaknesses in terms of like a straight up infantry fight, but Tomb Kings tend to very rarely take a straight up infantry fight. So, I'm going to put them right ahead of Beastmen in the Great column. Because of that. High Elves. Alrighty, High Elves. You guys, I think, get a bad rep. A lot of times what happens when people play High Elves, and the Duke has said this as well, is somebody decides to play High Elves, and somebody else says, I'm going to do a thematic game and play Dark Elves. And Dark Elves are about as hard of a counter to High Elves as you can get. So, what ends up happening is people are like, wow, High Elves suck, which they don't, as somebody who plays High Elves quite a bit can tell you. High Elves definitely have their clear-cut strengths and weaknesses. They're definitely a lot stronger near the beginning of battle because of martial prowess, and they do have a lot of very, very helpful, unique sub-faction units. They have very good lords, but a lot of it is very expensive. Like Imric and Tyrion and Alariel are all very expensive, so are the Archmages. They can bring invisible dragons, which I have not mentioned yet, but invisible dragons will be a big player to come, because invisible dragons, with Lore of Shadows, Smoke and Mirrors, could be a very powerful headquarters for your army and a very powerful support unit. But overall, I think High Elves are about average. They have good Cav play, they're a great all-rounder faction. They are deceptively difficult, as I find most factions are, but where I think people go wrong with High Elves is they tend to do a little bit of everything and not specialize them as much. You could do a little bit of everything with all factions, and I think in a lot of army comps, having at least one answer to everything is a good idea. But with High Elves, you do have those specialized units. You do have stuff like White Lions for armor crunching, and like Dragon Princes and Silver Helms for a Cav build. But not a whole lot to say with High Elves, just a pretty good faction. I'd personally recommend them. I find them to be a lot of fun. Dark Elves. Dark Elves! Alright. So, Dark Elves, kind of thinking about them, they're a really good faction. They have all kinds of sub-faction units, from Crone Hellebron's Hargoneth to Malice Darkblade's Cold One Cavalry Corps. And I think very highly of the Dark Elves, because the Dark Elves don't have a lot of very explicit weaknesses in the way that the High Elves do. The Dark Elves have murderous prowess, which allows them to regain a whole lot of vigor. Same thing with Orcs, which is another reason why Orcs are S tier. I say S tier, Realm of the Gods. It's another reason. They have very strong fundamental units. They have great chaff cutters with Blacker Corsairs. They have great AP missiles with Dark Shards. They have great skirmish play with Scourge Runner Chariots and Dark Raiders. They have great fundamental cavalry forces with Dark Riders. And they have incredibly good shock cavalry with Cold One Knights. They have fantastic monsters, both at range with the Medusa, monster hunters like the Charybdis, and infantry killers like the Dragon and Hydra. And I don't even think I have to tell you guys how good their lords are. However, there are some things that hold the Dark Elves back. Generally no number count, a lot of expensive units, and a bit of the side effect of playing the edgiest faction. But in all seriousness, Dark Elves are at the top of great. They're not really Orcs level, purely because their weaknesses are more easily exploited than Orcs, but they are definitely better than Doom Kings and Beastmen. Alright. Norska! Hoo-ha! And keep in mind, I'm not including Skeggi in this, because Skeggi is Astalia, and the Decadent Host is Kislev. Don't question it, just go with it. Now, Norska, I think, is in a bit of a similar boat to the High Elves. They have some pretty good Marauders, and they do have some Chaos Marks. They have some good Lords, but Wulfric is not the terror that he once was, now that mounts have been reworked. And while I do think people overlook Throg quite a bit, I quite like Throg. Norska, it has nice skirmish play with its chariots and with its wildkin. It has some good infantry choices, but there isn't a whole lot, like, truly exceptional. There isn't a whole lot that you look at Norska and go, wow, that's a game carrier. Obviously there are things like skinwolves and mammoths, but that's all fairly easy to counter. They may have access to trolls and chaos marks, but it's not a deal breaker. Norska is a very army-focused faction instead of specific units and synergies-focused factions. I think in general, that's the trend with the end times. You're far more focused on your army as a whole than you are on specific units. But Norska has really gotten that treatment more than other factions. And your Marauder shield walls and Norskan tactics, while they are still good, generally speaking, do not have a whole lot of exceptional qualities. So, while Norska, being a great monster hunting faction, is definitely worthy of your time, and I would personally recommend them a lot, I'm simply going to put them in average because they lack a kind of wow factor that would push them up further in the tier list. Yeah, I'll keep them there. They, I mean, I'm not necessarily a Norskan expert, but I do think that a lot of their stuff, while it is good, is not like army carrying good. Which is why I'm going to put them in average. And keep in mind, average does not mean bad. Neither does even requires extensive skill. There's no faction in the end times, in my opinion, that is like, that you cannot play and have success with in a multiplayer setting. Empire. Alright, I think everybody sees where I'm putting Empire. And they could kind of tell it from a mile away. So, Empire is pretty much as average as you can get. They have a lot of good units, and I think I am going to place them ahead of Norska and ahead of the High Elves. And the reason for that is twofold. So the Empire can cover their weaknesses a lot more than Norska and High Elves. They don't have number weaknesses quite like the High Elves, and they don't suffer from Norska having a lack of really army-carrying units, things like the Steam Tank, Royal Altar of Gryphites, and Reiksguard. They have some very good lords, and a lot of very good utility lords. I think people overlook Marcus Wolfhard a lot. They have very good sub-faction units with Middenland. And I think it'd be hard-pressed to find Empire armies that don't tend to have an answer to things. Empire armies tend to fairly regularly have answers to things. But none of those answers are particularly oppressive. Like, you can bring a mammoth and an Empire player can say, I'm going to bring a mixture of handguns and crossbows and archers. And you can say, well, I mean, that's like a hard counter to a mammoth. I could still make a mammoth work. And it's because of that lack of, like, definitive killing, which makes the Empire such, like, well, they are a strong faction. they're by no means an oppressive one. Vampire counts. I think we suffer from a lack of good multiplayer counts players. Because to play the counts truly well, there are a few things you have to understand. You have to be okay with sacrificing mass amounts of numbers to gain small advantages. You have to make sure that as the counts, you're keeping that risk-reward game high. And, most importantly of all, you're looking for a long battle. Not only do counts have great lord choices, great chaff infantry, as well as good just all-rounder infantry from revenants to graveguard to skeletons and zombies, especially the monster AP that are the impenitent. The strength of the counts has always been in their cav, and their cav force has been solid always. The sheer strength of Black Knights, Dire Wolves, and Blood Knights combined with Vampire Lords is just nasty, and the, of course, ability to resurrect those models with Invocation of Nehek cannot be overstated. The counts do suffer from some clear weaknesses. Incredibly large monsters, as well as some monstrous infantry, can pose issues for them, but less so than you would normally expect thanks to Grave Spear Guard and the Encased. The counts really don't suffer from a whole lot of those explicit weaknesses, and because of that, and because they are an undead faction, I'm going to put them slightly ahead of Beastmen in terms of great, because the vampire counts are just amazing. The reason I'm not putting them higher, even though I just praised them for a minute, is because if you've seen people who know how to fight counts, you'll see that that battle lasts about 2 minutes. Because the counts need time. The counts are like a tide, crashing and then releasing and then crashing again upon your army. And you need to understand that rhythm to understand the counts. Alright, Warriors of Chaos. So, the Warriors of the North have definitely gotten a lot of improvements in the end times. But one thing that I think people tend to forget is the fact that Warriors of Chaos are, well, pretty meh overall. They have a lot of very, very strong cavalry options, as well as Daughters of Chaos and Marauders. Meh was the wrong word to use. They have definitely been weakened, from Kolek nerfs to Siggy splitting off and doing his own thing, to large Archaon price increases. They have definitely had their fair share of turbulent times. But the Warriors of Chaos remain an incredibly powerful faction. Chaos Marks, while they have had their terror removed, are still very, very strong. And I think that the Warriors of Chaos deserve the kind of recognition and fear that they invoke. Of course, large, heavy units of infantry do have their inherent weaknesses, but I think that people neglect the strength of Chaos Cav and Chaos Monsters, as well as the cost-effectiveness of just basic Chaos Warriors. With those weaknesses, I'm going to put them ahead of Norska and right ahead of the High Elves. Because they do have some weaknesses, but make no mistake, even though they're forced into a fairly elite playstyle, the Warriors of Chaos are coming. And while I may say that they're a pretty average in strength faction, beware on the campaign map. Just because you don't have to fear them on the multiplayer battle as much as, say, the Empire, doesn't mean that you mustn't prepare for the end times on campaign. Alright. The best faction in the history of fantasy to have ever fantasied ever. Skaven. Now the reason Skaven need a complete buff and need all the reworks and help they can get, and now that everybody has simultaneously said, wait, what? Alright. Skaven. I love Skaven. And I'm going to make no mistake that my placement for Skaven is probably going to be a little bit skewed. But I think they're great. Skaven take that kind of versatility that a faction like the Dark Elves have and says, let's crank it up to 11! Obviously, no faction suffers from leadership malices quite like the Skaven, but no faction does a gunpowder line like the Skaven. No faction can bring powerful regenerating monster cores quite like the Skaven. No faction can run you over with wolf rats quite like the Skaven. No faction has infantry skirmishers and ambushers so powerful that they make cav cores afraid of them, quite like the Skaven. No faction has lords as effective in infantry fights with warp shard armor like Queek, quite like the Skaven. No one has summons quite like the Skaven. At least, no one has as easy... Well, vampire counts of summons quite like Skaven, but you get my point. That being the Skaven are such specialized of a faction. They have so many tools, but are so incredibly difficult. I cannot help but put them in great. Now, where they really lie in great can kind of vary. I do think I will put them about there. The reason is because Skaven have some of the biggest Achilles heels of any faction. They're suffering from leadership and their general lack of just a few solid elite troops. Even though they're propelled by everything from sub-faction units to great cost-effective lord choices, they do always have their issues, and while amazing Skaven mains such as myself will always continue to sing their praises, there will be people who deny the magic. But I highly recommend you implore Skaven as a nice look. Vampire Coast, and we'll be done with all the non-end times added unique factions. So, Vampire Coast have undergone some changes here. And I'm not going to try and hide it. These guys are Realm of the Gods material. Zombies just got a buff, and Depth Guard just got a well-deserved nerf, but I am going to put them behind greenskins for a few reasons. So, Vampire Coast has summoning, they have dogs and harassers, they have good monstrous infantry cores, they have ethereal units, they have hordes of sub-factions that can make them incredibly versatile, from Sartosa to the Drowned. They have some of the best lord choices in the game, just bar none, like Noctilus and Aranessa and Vampire Lords, and Silastra Deerfin, and of course Luther Harkin. They have very good answers to things like magic. They're an incredibly oppressive faction from range, as well as very easy sources of armor piercing as well as armor. They have the Bloaty Boy, they have a whole lot of great monstrous infantry. They're just fabulous, and not to mention they're undead. The reason I put them behind the greenskins is because the Vampire Coast is a lot more expensive than greenskins. The Vampire Coast does have some issues with cost effectiveness at times, and you do run into issues with Vampire Coast where a lot of your army will not be on the field at the beginning of the fight. Of course, if you can hold out long enough, that's good, but it also makes it significantly easier for your enemy to kill you off quicker. So for right now, while I do think Vampire Coast deserve to be recognized as a faction in the Realm of the Gods, I am going to put them behind greenskins. Alrighty. So, Kislev and the Decadent Hosts. So, the Decadent Host is basically just a merger of the Warriors of Chaos and Norska, but it kind of combines the great aspects of both. So, what's important to note is the Warriors of Chaos have a lot of very good infantry choices, and the Decadent Host doesn't get access to all of the great stuff. But they do get Chaos-marked Warriors of Shornal, for instance. Warriors of Slaanesh. And they do get a lot of the monster hunting and synergy-based units of Norska. A lot of Norska's great support units and their powerful monsters are mixed into the Decadent Host. And a lot of Chaos's strong fundamentals are mixed in as well. So, I am going to put the Decadent Host above both Chaos and Norska, because they have that added layer of flavor and versatility. Obviously, they don't have access to all the same lords, but the Decadent Host does have those fairly strong generic lords and heroes. And finishing us off, the new kid on the block, and everyone's very welcome addition to the mod, and honestly some of Duke's best work yet, Skeggy! I'm sorry, I know I've been really calm for the majority of this video, so my apologies if that kind of threw you off me going, Skeggy! But, Skeggy. Skeggy is a super versatile and fun faction. They have a whole lot of powerful infantry and AP and great lords, a Hofkarl summon from Lost Ericsson of the Cull. I think it goes without saying that Skeggy eat Lizardmen for breakfast, like 9 times out of 10. We all know which way that match is ending. Because if you were to say clone me, for instance, and give me control of a Lizardman army and a Skeggy army, I will beat my clone playing Skeggy instead of Lizardmen like 9 times out of 10. But Skeggy doesn't only bring Lizardmen beating to the table, it brings Lizardmen monsters, Norskan support and cavalry, Empire soldiers, some very good light and medium cavalry. Honestly, I think the light and medium cavalry is very underrated. And good lord choices. So, because of their sheer and combined versatility and their powerfulness moving as a single cohesive army, I'm going to put them at the top of good. And there you go. That is the Total Warhammer entirely objective end time